In January of 1898, with snow moving sideways across the western Nebraska prairie, Eliza Ward did something no sensible homesteader was supposed to do in a blizzard. She closed the damper on her iron stove and let the fire sink to a dull red. Across the room, Noah Briggs stared at her as if she had lost her mind. He had just brought his wife and 2 children through the storm after a split stovepipe filled their frame house with smoke. His beard was white with frost. His youngest boy was still shaking. "Eliza," he said, "that fire is dying, I know." The wind struck the north wall with a low, steady roar. The room did not turn cold. A brass thermometer beside the inner stone wall stayed in the low 60s. The floor near the south side was still faintly warm beneath a stock-hinged foot. Eliza's children sat at the table without coats, and beside the door, the wood-splitting axe that had once ruled every winter hour remained untouched on its peg. Noah looked at the weak stove, then at the thick limestone around him. 6 months earlier, he had told Eliza that stone was the worst material a poor family could choose for a winter house. Now his own children were warming their hands inside one. How had a widowed homesteader turned an abandoned freight ruin into a house that could carry the warmth of a winter afternoon deep into a January night? The answer had begun the winter before, with an axe. Eliza Ward was not an architect. She had never studied engineering, and nobody in western Nebraska would have used the words passive solar around her kitchen table. But she had grown up beside a brickworks in eastern Missouri, where her father tended firing kilns. As a girl, she had learned that heat did not vanish the instant a flame disappeared. Long after a kiln door had been bricked shut and the firing ended, the walls remained dangerous to touch. The clay, brick, and stone seemed to remember the fire. She did not know the modern term thermal mass. She knew only that heavy things change temperature slowly. By 1897, Eliza was raising 2 children and keeping a small homestead alive on her own. Her son Sam was 12. Her daughter Rose was 7. Their first full winter on the high plains had stripped away any romance Eliza might once have attached to frontier life. Their house was a common one for a family with little money. A timber frame, rough boards, paper behind the siding where they could afford it, and a cast iron stove that was expected to do the work of a furnace, wall, blanket, and miracle. When the northwest wind rose, it found every imperfect joint. Cold air slipped around the door latch. It came through the window sash. It moved under the floor. On the worst mornings, a rim of frost formed along the inside corners of the glass. Eliza learned to sleep lightly because the stove could not. Every few hours she woke, crossed the dark room, opened the iron door, and fed it again. The fuel was not free simply because trees existed somewhere in Nebraska. Good firewood had to be cut, traded for, hauled, stacked, kept dry, split small enough for the stove, and carried inside 1 armload at a time. On the open prairie, every stick represented distance and labor. The axe became the clock of the season. Before breakfast, she split wood. Before supper, she split wood. When a cold front was coming, she split wood until her palms blistered beneath old calluses. Sam helped, but he was still a boy, and Eliza refused to let winter turn his childhood into nothing but hauling fuel. By February, the woodpile looked frighteningly low. One night the temperature fell hard after sunset. Eliza woke to Rose coughing beneath 2 quilts. The stove had gone dim. Wind hissed through the south window frame, pulling heat from the room faster than the iron could replace it. Eliza fed in the last dry split pieces she had stacked indoors, then stood over her sleeping children listening to the stove catch. The fire brightened. The room did not. That was the moment the problem changed in her mind. Until then, she had thought, like nearly everyone around her, that winter comfort was mostly a question of fuel. If the house was cold, burn more. If the fire fell, build it higher. But standing there at 2 in the morning, she realized she was not failing to make heat. She was failing to keep it. By spring, Eliza had started watching buildings differently. On bright mornings, she noticed that frost disappeared first from dark fence posts and south-facing stones. A pile of flat rock behind the barn would stay warm well after sunset if the afternoon had been clear. The packed earth just inside the south door of the shed sometimes held a little warmth, even when the air cooled fast. She began remembering the brick kilns of her childhood, not the flames, the walls after the flames. At the eastern edge of her claim stood an abandoned freight house from an older wagon route, a squat limestone rectangle that had lost its roof years before. The railroad had pulled traffic away from the road, and the building had become a place where tumbleweeds collected and rabbits disappeared through gaps in the floor. Most people saw free stone waiting to be quarried. Eliza saw something closer to a cold kiln. The walls were thick. The interior floor included broad slabs of dark local stone. 2 large loading openings happened to face south, where the low winter sun could enter if they were closed with glass instead of boards. She stood in that roofless shell one March afternoon while snow still lay in shaded ditches. Sunlight fell through the southern openings and spread across the stone floor. She crouched and pressed her palm to a slab that had been in the light. It was warmer than the shaded stone beside it. Not hot, just different. That difference was enough to start an idea. She did not start building the next day. For several weeks she tested the thought in small ways because lumber and glass were too expensive for guessing. She carried 2 flat stones into the old frame house. One she placed where afternoon sun came through the window. The other stayed beneath a table in shade. Near supper, she wrapped each in the same scrap of cloth and held them in her hands. The sunlit stone stayed warmer longer. Then she began marking shadows inside the freight shell. Sam drove short pegs between cracks in the floor, and Eliza noted where the edge of sunlight reached at different hours. By late spring, the sun climbed higher, and the bright patch retreated. That told her something useful, too. A deep summer sun did not need to pour across the whole room. The lower winter sun was the one she wanted. She also watched the ruin during wind. Dust slipped through joints high on the north wall and swirled in little circles inside. The stone itself was solid, but the open roof and broken openings made the shell useless as shelter. Whatever heat she collected would be wasted if moving air simply carried it away. So Eliza's plan became less romantic and more demanding. She needed a roof before she needed a stove. She needed tight joinery before she needed more firewood. She needed glass in the south openings, but some way to cover that glass after dark. And she needed enough exposed masonry inside the weather shell to absorb heat rather than hiding every surface behind wood. By the time she asked Noah for a price, she was not asking whether the old freight house could be made warm. She was asking what the weak points would cost to control. Noah Briggs heard about the plan before Eliza had bought her first piece of lumber. Noah was a capable carpenter and a practical man. He had helped build 6 houses in the district, and he distrusted ideas that required a person to ignore what everyone already knew. When Eliza asked him what it would cost to put a roof over the old freight house, he walked the walls, measured the spans, and frowned. "You can roof it," he said, "but I wouldn't sleep in it in January. Stone sweats cold. You'll spend all day heating those walls before you ever warm yourself." Eliza looked toward the southern openings. "What if I heat the stone with the sun?" Noah laughed once. Not cruelly, but with the reflex of a man who thought the question answered itself. "Then you'd better order sunshine for midnight." Eliza hired him anyway. The roof was only the first part. She did not try to recreate a fashionable house inside the old shell. She treated the building as a system. The new roof was framed tight and strong, with a low attic packed with dry, insulating material to slow heat escaping upward. The north and west sides received the fewest openings. The old door was rehung, fitted, and weather-stripped, as well as frontier materials allowed. Then came the expensive part. From a hotel renovation in a railroad town to the east, Eliza bought salvaged window sash and mismatched panes. Some glass was wavy. Some panes were smaller than the frames that eventually held them. None of it looked elegant. But when Noah set the rebuilt sash into the two broad south openings, winter sunlight would have a path directly into the room. Behind the glass, Eliza left the darkest floor slabs exposed. Near the center of the room, she rebuilt the stove on a heavy brick and stone hearth instead of a thin sheet of iron. The masonry around it was not meant to make a hotter fire. It was meant to absorb some of that heat and release it more slowly. Noah watched her rub mortar into the last joint. "So the stones are your woodpile now?" "No," Eliza said. "They're my bucket. The fire and the sun still have to fill it." That answer made him stop smiling. It was the first time he understood she was not expecting heat from nowhere. She was trying to change when the heat was available. By October, the freight house had become a home. The first clear, cold day felt like vindication. Morning air came sharp off the plains, but after noon the low sun passed through the south windows and stretched deep across the floor. The exposed stone brightened. The hearth warmed. By late afternoon, Eliza could let the stove fall lower than she would have dared in the old frame house. After sunset, the room cooled slowly. Sam noticed first. "It's not dropping fast," he said. Checking the thermometer Eliza had mounted where she could watch it from the table. Eliza smiled. Then the weather changed. 3 days of low gray cloud followed. The sun vanished behind a flat ceiling of winter sky. The south windows became cold surfaces instead of heat collectors. Wind pressed against the frames. On the second night, the room temperature fell faster than Eliza expected. She built the stove higher. By midnight, Rose was wearing her coat indoors. Noah had been right about one thing. Stone could be brutally unforgiving if it started cold, and nothing replaced the heat leaving the building. Eliza's first design had failed. Not completely, but enough to matter. The next morning she did not blame the weather, and she did not defend the idea to the children. She walked the room before sunrise with a lamp and a strip of loose thread. Near the south sash, the thread bent toward a thin stream of incoming air. At the attic hatch, it fluttered again. Along one corner of the roof, a faint line of frost marked where warm indoor moisture had found a colder surface. Eliza wrote 3 words on the fuel board beneath her tally: marks, glass, roof, wind. She had built the part that collected and stored heat before she had fully controlled the paths that were draining it away. Noah came by that afternoon to see how the house had behaved during the cloudy spell. Eliza expected him to enjoy being right. Instead, when he saw the thread move beside the sash, the carpenter in him took over. He pushed a knife blade into one joint, frowned, and climbed into the attic. "You've got air washing through here," he called down. "Not much. Enough?" Eliza handed him more packing material. "Then enough is too much." For 2 days they worked on the places the first cold spell had exposed. The repair did not change the principle of the house. It made the principle possible. That distinction mattered. A heavy wall could hold heat, but if wind kept replacing warm indoor air with cold outdoor air, the stored energy would be spent reheating a moving target. And a large south window could collect winter sun by day, then become a major lost surface after dark. The failure had shown Eliza where the design was honest and where it was still wishful thinking. This was the point where the story could have ended as a warning about an expensive mistake. Instead, Eliza paid attention to the failure. The floor held warmth on sunny days. The hearth held warmth after the stove was banked. The problem was that too much of that stored energy escaped through the easiest paths, especially the glass and the roofline. Thermal mass was not insulation. Heavy stone could store a great deal of heat, but it could not promise that the heat would stay where a family needed it. The house needed both sides of the equation, something to absorb energy and a shell that slowed its loss. Eliza went back to work. She and Sam built interior shutters for the south windows from light boards, layering old wool and felt where they could. The shutters stayed open on clear winter days and closed shortly after sunset. She sealed gaps around the sash with strips of cloth and putty. Noah returned to tighten the attic work and close 2 leaks where wind had been washing through the eaves. The changes were plain, almost embarrassingly simple. Let the sun in when it could help. Cover the glass when it could not. Keep the roof tight. Use the stove to add heat when the sky failed. Give the stone time to absorb it. Then stop asking the stove to do everything alone. There was another limitation Eliza understood before winter even arrived in full. The same south glass that helped in January could overheat the room under a higher summer sun if it remained fully exposed. She planned a shallow exterior shade for the warm season and accepted that the house would still need ventilation in hot weather. This was not a machine that defeated climate. It was a house designed to cooperate with a particular season. By December, the pattern was clear. On bright days, sunlight entered from late morning through the afternoon and warmed the stone floor, the hearth, and the inner face of the masonry. As evening came, Eliza closed the shutters. The stove burned modestly, usually hottest around supper, then lower through the night. The mass of the building softened the temperature swings. The room did not become tropical. It became steady. That steadiness was what changed their lives. In the old frame house, warmth existed close to the stove and disappeared quickly when the fire weakened. In the rebuilt freight house, the surfaces around them were less brutally cold after a sunny day. The family no longer lived inside a small ring of heat surrounded by freezing walls. The stove still mattered. Cloudy weather still mattered. Shutters mattered. A tight roof mattered. The stone was not magic. It was storage, and storage changed how hard the family had to chase every hour of warmth. Eliza began keeping a simple fuel tally with pencil marks on a board beside the wood box. She was not running a scientific experiment. She wanted to know whether all the work had actually reduced the number of armloads she carried. Week after week, the answer was visible. The puff fell more slowly. That winter, the axe stopped being the clock of every day. Then January brought the test no careful autumn could provide. A deep cold front dropped over the plains, followed by wind strong enough to erase wagon tracks within minutes. The sky cleared after the storm front passed, which made the days bright and the nights vicious. During daylight, sun poured through Eliza's south windows while the air outside remained bitter. The exposed floor and hearth absorbed what they could. Before sunset, she closed the shutters, checked the roof hatch, fed the stove, and banked it. The first night passed, then the second. On the third evening, shortly after dark, someone struck the door hard enough to rattle the latch. Eliza opened it to find Noah Briggs leaning into the wind with his wife, Clara, behind him and two bundled children between them. A section of stovepipe in Noah's house had split near a joint. Smoke had begun spilling into the room whenever the wind forced air down the flue. He could repair it in daylight. In the darkness and gale, with the roof slick and the metal dangerously cold, he was not willing to risk it. So the carpenter who had warned Eliza that her stone house would become a winter tomb brought his family to her door for shelter. Eliza did not mention the old argument. She brought them inside. For several minutes, Noah said almost nothing. He was too busy noticing what was wrong with the scene. The stove should have been roaring. It was not. The iron sides were hot, but not glowing. There was no towering stack of split wood beside it. The children were not gathered in a tight circle around the heat. Sam sat several feet away, reading by lamplight. Rose was helping Clara pull wet mittens from the younger children. Noah walked to the thermometer. Then he looked at Eliza. "How long has that fire been this low?" "Since supper, and before that." The sun did most of the afternoon work. Noah glanced at the shuttered south windows. "They're closed. Now they are." He crossed the room and put his palm against the stone floor near the southern side. It was not warm like a stovetop. It did not need to be. It was simply not icy. He touched the masonry of the hearth. Then the inner stone wall. The great surprise was not heat. It was the absence of cold. In a drafty house, cold surfaces pull comfort from the body even when the air near the stove is warm. Here, after a bright day, the massive interior surfaces had spent hours absorbing energy. The shutters and tight shell were slowing how quickly that energy escaped. Noah had spent his life thinking about walls as barriers. Eliza had started thinking about some of them as batteries. That did not mean every stone house would behave this way. A dark, uninsulated masonry room with poor orientation could be miserable. A week of clouds would force Eliza to burn much more fuel. Broken glass would ruin the balance quickly. Bad roof work could drain the stored heat almost as fast as the sun supplied it. What worked here was the combination: south light, mass inside the protected space, a tight roof, night shutters, a small stove for the hours nature refused to cooperate, and a woman willing to revise the design after the first version disappointed her. Noah stayed awake longer than anyone else that night. Part of it was worry about his own house. Part of it was professional embarrassment. Near midnight, the wind rose again. The outer shutters trembled. A low moan moved around the north corner of the freight house. Noah got up from the bench where Eliza had made him a bed and checked the stove. The fire was barely more than coals. His instinct was to reach for wood. Eliza, still awake at the table, shook her head. "Give it a little time." He waited. The room remained comfortable, not perfectly warm in every corner, not untouched by the cold, but stable enough that the sleeping children did not stir. Noah sat back down. In the morning the wind had eased, but the cold had not. Sunlight returned through the south glass after Eliza opened the shutters. A bright rectangle moved slowly across the floor. Noah watched it as if it were a piece of machinery. That was the change in him. He no longer saw sunlight as weather. He saw an input. He no longer saw the stone floor as dead weight. He saw storage. And he no longer saw every crack or thin pane as a minor inconvenience. He saw a leak in a system. After breakfast, Noah walked home, repaired his stovepipe, and began looking at his own house with the same kind of suspicion. He could not turn a timber cabin into a limestone freight house, nor did he try. Instead, he tightened the worst leaks, added a removable night covering over the largest south window, and later built a heavier masonry surround behind the stove. The changes were smaller than Eliza's, but that was part of the point. The lesson was not that everyone needed a ruined stone building. The lesson was that comfort came from managing heat, not simply making more of it. News traveled slowly through the district, mostly by supper tables, church steps, and neighbors helping one another after storms. People came to see Eliza's house. Some wanted to know whether the stone itself created heat. She corrected them. Some wanted to know whether they could stop cutting wood. She corrected them, too. On cloudy stretches, her stove worked hard. When snow covered the lower part of the south windows, Sam shoveled it away. When wind found a new gap, Eliza sealed it. When spring climbed higher in the sky, she rigged shade outside the south glass so the room would not become an oven. There was maintenance. There were limits. There was no free winter. But there was a better balance. By the end of the season, Eliza's fuel board told the story more honestly than any speech could have done. The family had burned substantially less wood than during their winter in the frame house, even though the stone home enclosed more usable space. The exact saving varied with the weather, and Eliza never pretended otherwise. What mattered was the change in the family's daily labor. Sam had more mornings for schoolwork. Rose stopped waking as often when the stove fell low. Eliza no longer measured every cold night by how many armloads remained outside. The old freight house had not defeated winter. It had changed the timing of the fight. The sun did work in the afternoon. The stone carried part of that work into the evening. The shutters slowed its escape. The stove filled the gaps. Each part did only what it could do, but together they asked less from the one resource Eliza had been exhausting herself to provide. Years later, people would have better words for the ideas involved: thermal, mass, solar gain, air sealing, insulation, seasonal shading. Eliza had none of those terms. She had a childhood memory of kiln walls, a ruined freight house on her claim, and one winter that taught her the difference between producing heat and holding it. The intelligence was not in discovering a new law of nature. It was in noticing which laws were already collecting a price from her, then arranging the house so they could finally work in her favor. At dawn, the axe was still on its peg.